Gibraltar's strategic location has meant that over the years it has enjoyed an importance which is out of all proportion to its size. It is a territory that has been fought over by Moor, Spaniard and Briton. It is a place that has seen many sieges, and it is the 18th century sieges that I'm going to be talking about in this series. Gibraltar was taken on the 4th of August 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession. Initially, it was taken in the name of the Austrian pretender to the Spanish throne, the Archduke Charles of Austria, who had himself proclaimed King Charles III of Spain in Vienna. So initially, Gibraltar was not British, and the Union Jack did not fly over Gibraltar. The capture of Gibraltar was only one campaign in the War of the Spanish Succession, which continued for a number of years. But why was there a war in the first place? The answer to that lies in 1700, when Carlos II, King Charles II of Spain, died childless. There was no obvious heir to succeed him. Carlos II was the last of the Habsburg dynasty to rule in Spain. The first was Philip I of Castile. He was married to Juana la Loca, Jane the Mad. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. And their son was the first to rule under a unified Spain. He was Charles I of Spain, but we know him as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, after whom this wall is named. To make matters more complicated, King Charles II of Spain made a will, and in it he named as his heir Duke Philip of Anjou. Now, this was an issue because Philip was French, he was a member of the Bourbon royal family, and he was the grandson of the magnificent Sun King, King Louis XIV of France. Neither Britain nor the Netherlands wanted there to be close family ties between the French and Spanish royal houses. That is why they went to war with Austria in support of the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne. And the war became known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Matters changed dramatically in July 1711 when the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles I, suddenly died. He was the elder brother of Archduke Charles of Austria, who succeeded him as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Now, had the Holy Roman Empire expanded to also include Spain, the Spanish territories in Europe, and the Spanish possessions in the New World, that would have altered the balance of world power hugely. Britain and the Netherlands now no longer wanted to have Archduke Charles, now Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, as King of Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession had taken a completely different perspective. They now preferred Philip of Anjou, but only under certain conditions. By this time, Britain and France were both tired of the war, which was costing them a fortune. It was time to negotiate a peace, particularly because France was now content that a French prince was going to be recognized as the next King of Spain. On the 8th of October 1711, preliminaries of peace were agreed between Britain and France. Then, on the 29th of January 1712, a congress opened in Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands. It took many months to negotiate the peace settlements. France wanted to ensure that it got what it wanted before the peace treaties with Spain were signed. So, to this end, the French held up the Spanish plenipotentiaries in France, and they got to Utrecht late. So it's not surprising that the first of the treaties of Utrecht to be signed was that between Britain and France of the 11th of April, 1713. We're used to talking about the Treaty of Utrecht as if it were a single treaty. But in fact, there were a series of treaties that were entered into at Utrecht, many of them of a commercial character or which had commercial ramifications. Now, under the treaty entered into by Britain with France, Britain made important territorial gains. It acquired the island of Newfoundland, it acquired Nova Scotia, and up in the north of Canada, the area known as the Hudson Bay Company Territories, which is there below the Arctic Circle. Also, Britain got an island in the Caribbean, the island of St. Christopher, which was known as St. Kitts. But just as important as these territorial gains was the renouncement by Duke Philip of Anjou of all claims to the French throne. So Britain now was clear that there was no possibility of the crowns of France and Spain being united under a single person. With the French treaty agreed, it was time for Britain to put in place a treaty with Spain. And that was signed at Utrecht on the 13th of July, 1713. Here in the Garrison Library, there are two copies of the Treaty of Utrecht. The first one is a copy of the treaty in English and in Latin. And the other copy is the treaty in Spanish. Curiously, the titles of the two treaties are different because the English version refers to a treaty of peace and friendship, whereas the Spanish version is simply Tratado de Paz. There's not a word about friendship. But the Spanish version is particularly interesting because a previous owner wrote his name on the cover. Here it is, N.F. Bassadoni, Nicholas Bassadoni. He was born in Gibraltar in 1794, and he was a bibliophile, and he amassed quite a large library of interesting books. In fact, one other book that belonged to his library is here. It's an Arabic grammar, Latin Arabic, and it was published in Rome in 1631. Nicholas Bassadoni lived here at the top of Prince Edward's Road, and it was here that he greatly expanded the property and built a library, and he had his Spanish copy of the Treaty of Utrecht in that library. We all know that Article 10 of the Treaty of Utrecht, which is here, refers to Gibraltar. But what else did the treaty cover? Britain made three important gains under the Treaty of Utrecht with Spain. First of all, under Article 10, Gibraltar became British in perpetuity, forever. Under Article 11, there was another territorial gain. The island of Menorca was ceded by Spain to Britain, again in perpetuity. The third important gain was nothing to do with territorial acquisition, but with something called el asiento. Now, the full name of el asiento was el Pacto del Asiento de los Negros, and this related to the slave trade. What Britain acquired from Spain was the exclusive right to provide black slaves to the New World and to the Spanish possessions in the New World. There was another important dimension to the Treaty of Utrecht between Britain and Spain that related to land, because Spain lost all its possessions in Europe. Austria acquired the Kingdom of Naples, it acquired part of the Duchy of Milan, it acquired the Spanish Netherlands, and it acquired the island of Sardinia. Savoy, the Duke of Savoy, acquired the Kingdom of Sicily and also part of the Duchy of Milan. Importantly also, the Duke renounced his claim to the Spanish throne. So the loss by Spain of all its possessions in Europe was the beginning of the end of Spain as a colonial power. So from the British perspective, three important objectives had been achieved. Now, in the first place, the crowns of France and Spain had been kept separate. Secondly, Austria had not obtained the Spanish territories in the New World, in America. And thirdly, Britain had acquired territorial gains which were important for its mercantile growth and its naval interests. Let us look now a little more closely at Article 10 and what it actually sets out. Well, it provides for the cession of the full and entire propriety. The full and entire propriety, it means the ownership of the town and castle of Gibraltar, together with the port, fortifications, and forts thereunto belonging. And Britain was to have Gibraltar absolutely with all manner of right forever, without any exception or impediment whatsoever. What the treaty did not do was to define the terms, the language that it contained. What is meant by the town and the port of Gibraltar? The Upper Rock is not mentioned specifically, nor is the east side. Does it mean that they were not ceded? Well, clearly not, because it is not possible for Britain to enjoy the proprietorship, the ownership of Gibraltar, unless the entirety of Gibraltar had been ceded. And this is recognized by implication when it says that the fortifications and forts of Gibraltar were also ceded by Spain to Britain. What were these fortifications? Well, they included the Devil's Tower, which stood close to this site here off the north face of the rock. So it is clear that the isthmus was part of the land that was ceded to Britain by Spain. There was also another tower and a windmill that stood in this general area, and that tower would have formed part of the outlying defences of Gibraltar. So therefore, that would have been included in the grant from Spain. what was the port of Gibraltar in 1713? Well, for a start, what we call today the South Mole was the New Mole, and it was very, very much shorter than it is today. So it means that all the waters here, in what we now call the port of Gibraltar, were not a protected anchorage. It was not a safe place for anchoring ships. So this was not properly the port of Gibraltar. The principal pier was the Old Mole, in which I'm standing. This is the north wall, this is the south wall, and I'm in the middle between the walls. And the waters that were defended by this mole were the waters to the north. Now, the British later extended this pier, and they called it the Devil's Tongue, and it went as far as the Old Mole Head. The waters protected by the Old Mole extended as far and included this marina in La Linea. The water on both sides of this pier formed part of the original anchorage of Gibraltar. The anchorage of Gibraltar formed part of the original port in 1713. Now, there's no specific reference in the Treaty of Utrecht to Gibraltar territorial waters. And the reason for that is that the concept, as we know it today, did not exist then. In 1713, the land that was within range of the guns on the shore was deemed to belong to the land. And it did not need to be spelt out specifically in the Treaty of Utrecht, because everybody accepted that this was so and knew that this was the case. By way of contrast, the treaty specifically provided that the grant of Gibraltar was without any territorial jurisdiction and without any open communication by land with the country round about. But what precisely did this mean? In the first instance, we need to understand that Gibraltar in 1713 consisted not just of the Rock of Gibraltar and the city of Gibraltar, but also all the surrounding land, the area that today we know as the Campo area. So when the treaty specified that Gibraltar was being ceded without territorial jurisdiction, what it meant was that only Gibraltar itself, what we call Gibraltar today, was being ceded, and not the Campo area, the area round about in Spain. Critically, the precise boundary of the land that was being ceded by Spain under the Treaty of Utrecht was not defined, nor the precise limits of the territorial waters, and that has been the cause of differences of opinion ever since. Curiously, Britain agreed under Article 10 of the treaty that neither Jews nor Moors would be allowed to live in Gibraltar. And this may seem a very curious provision. Well, for Spain, it was a matter of the utmost importance, because since 1492, Spain had been systematically ridding itself of all Jews and Moors in Spain. As Britain did not initially intend to retain Gibraltar, it did not appear to be a matter of importance whether or not Jews and Moors were allowed to live in Gibraltar. In fact, it did matter. The attitude of Spain, both before and after Utrecht, was to deny provisions to Gibraltar. So they had to be sourced from the other side of the strait, from Morocco. Now, the subjects of the Emperor of Morocco, who were most closely involved in trade, were Jews. And the Jews were the ones who set up a community in Gibraltar for purposes of trade with Morocco. So there were Jews in Gibraltar shortly after 1704. And it was because of the Jews that Gibraltar was able to survive. Spain's approach to direct communication with Gibraltar was actually in contravention of the direct terms of Article 10. Because what the article provided was that when it was good weather, there should be no direct communication by land between Gibraltar and Spain, and then clarified that the reason for this was to prevent any fraud on the Spanish exchequer, to prevent anything fraudulently being exported from Gibraltar into Spain. It was envisaged that there should be free and open communication at all times by sea between Gibraltar and Spain. And if there were bad weather and it was not possible for there to be communication by sea, then at that stage there should be communication by land, so that people in Gibraltar would at all times be able to buy whatever they needed from Spain. And it further set out that when buying goods from Spain, goods had to be bought for ready cash. They could not be exchanged or bartered, because in that way goods that were dutiable in Spain could not be introduced from Gibraltar. In practice, Spain forbade all communication between Gibraltar and Spain by land and by sea, other than when it chose to allow it. The last section of Article 10 set out that if Britain ever wished to dispose of or sell Gibraltar, then the preference of the sale would be offered to Spain. It was not envisaged that Gibraltar would necessarily be given back to Spain ever for free. In essence, Article 10 provided that Gibraltar was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. In addition, there was to be no trade between Gibraltar and Spain, but only in order to safeguard Spain and ensure that Spain was not the object of fraud. There was to be freedom of religious worship for Roman Catholics in Gibraltar. No Jews and no Moors were to live here. And finally, if Britain ever wished to sell or otherwise dispose of Gibraltar, then Spain was to have the first option. The treaty achieved a number of British objectives. In the first place, Britain made territorial gains. It got Gibraltar and it got Minorca. Also, it got el asiento, the monopoly over the Spanish slave trade. Also, Spain lost its colonies in Europe, its territories in Europe, and was greatly weakened as a colonial power. And finally, France and Spain, the crowns of France and Spain, were kept separate. Utrecht was a success. It ushered in over 25 years of peace in Europe. In fact, the next war was not until 1739, which was the War of Jenkins' Ear, which merged with the War of the Austrian Succession. There were later opportunities to clarify those points within Article 10 of the Treaty of Utrecht between Britain and Spain that had remained vague. In particular, the definition of what the land of Gibraltar actually was and what the port of Gibraltar meant. There was an opportunity at the end of the siege of 1727 when you had the peace treaty of Seville. And there was again another opportunity after the Great Siege when you had the Treaty of Versailles in 1783. But unfortunately, neither of those opportunities was taken. The Treaty of Utrecht of the 13th of July 1713 between Britain and Spain was of fundamental importance. It laid the foundations for British Gibraltar, and Gibraltar has prospered and grown and developed ever since under the British flag for over 300 years.